My name is Elena Martinez, and I am 34 years old. I never imagined that telling the truth would cost me everything I held dear. The morning I decided to speak up, I was sitting in my childhood kitchen, watching my mother prepare breakfast with the same mechanical precision she had maintained for decades. The smell of coffee and toast filled the air, but underneath it all, I could sense the rot that had been festering in our family for years. My hands trembled as I held the photographs that would shatter our carefully constructed facade. These weren't just pictures. They were evidence of a truth so devastating that it would turn my own blood against me. But I had carried this burden for too long, and the weight of silence was crushing my soul. The decision to speak came suddenly, like a dam bursting after years of pressure. I had spent countless nights lying awake, wrestling with the knowledge that threatened to destroy everything we appeared to be. Our family had always prided itself on respectability, on being pillars of our small community. My father, Robert Martinez, was a respected businessman who owned 3 hardware stores across town. My mother, Carmen, was involved in every charity, organization, and church committee. My older brother David was a successful lawyer with political aspirations. And then there was me, the youngest, the one who had always been expected to fall in line and maintain the perfect family image. But perfection is often just a beautiful lie, and I had discovered the ugliest truth imaginable. The photographs in my hands showed my father with his business partner's teenage daughter, Sarah, in compromising positions. I had found them hidden in his office safe while looking for important documents after he had suffered a minor heart attack. The images were date-stamped from 2 years ago, when Sarah was only 16. My father wasn't just a respected businessman. He was a predator who had been using his position of power to abuse a child. The discovery had left me physically ill for days. I had confronted my father privately, hoping against hope that there was some explanation, some misunderstanding. But his reaction had confirmed my worst fears. He didn't deny it. Instead, he had tried to justify his actions, claiming that Sarah had been mature for her age, that she had wanted it. His words had made me sick to my stomach. When I threatened to go to the police, he had laughed coldly and reminded me that exposing him would destroy our entire family. He was right about that, but wrong about my willingness to protect him at the expense of justice. I had spent weeks researching Sarah's family, learning that they had moved away shortly after the incidents. I managed to track them down and discovered that Sarah had attempted suicide twice and was receiving intensive therapy. The guilt of our family's secret was eating me alive. Every family gathering felt like a performance. Every smile from my mother felt like a betrayal. Every proud word about my father's community contributions made me want to scream. I had tried to convince myself that staying silent was the right choice, that destroying our family wouldn't undo the damage already done to Sarah. But the truth has a way of demanding to be heard, and I could no longer live with the knowledge that my silence was protecting a monster. The morning I decided to speak, I had received a letter from Sarah's mother, thanking our family for our support during a difficult time. She had no idea that the difficult time was caused by my father's actions. That letter was the final straw. I couldn't allow my family to continue accepting gratitude and respect that we didn't deserve. I knew that speaking up would make me an outcast, that my family would see me as the destroyer of everything they had worked to build. But I also knew that remaining silent would make me complicit in my father's crimes. The choice between family, loyalty, and moral obligation was tearing me apart. But deep down, I knew there was only one right path forward. As I sat in that kitchen, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of my childhood, I prepared to speak the words that would change everything forever. The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like water through a broken dam. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in my mind, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of watching my mother's face transform from maternal warmth to absolute horror. She dropped the coffee mug she had been holding, and it shattered against the kitchen floor, sending ceramic fragments scattering across the tiles like pieces of our broken family. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed my revelation. My father, who had been reading his newspaper at the breakfast table, slowly lowered it and looked at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. For a moment, I thought he might actually strike me. His face had turned a deep shade of red, and his hands were clenched into fists. But it was my mother's reaction that truly broke my heart. She began to shake her head repeatedly, as if she could somehow will my words back into silence. Her voice, when she finally found it, was barely above a whisper. She asked me how I could say such terrible things about my own father, how I could make up such horrible lies. The pain in her voice was unbearable, but I forced myself to continue. I placed the photographs on the kitchen table, watching as my mother's denial crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence. She picked up one of the images with trembling hands, and I saw the exact moment when her world collapsed. The color drained from her face, and she aged 10 years in an instant. My father's reaction was quite different. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and began pacing like a caged animal. His initial shock had given way to calculated anger, and I could see him already formulating his defense strategy. He accused me of stealing from his private papers, of violating his trust, of being a vindictive daughter who wanted to destroy the family out of some twisted sense of righteousness. His words stung, but they also confirmed what I had always known about his character. Even caught red-handed, he was more concerned about protecting himself than acknowledging the harm he had caused. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything our family had ever experienced. My mother oscillated between disbelief and devastation, one moment defending my father and the next staring at him as if he were a stranger. She kept asking why, over and over again, as if there could be any explanation that would make sense of such betrayal. My father, meanwhile, began making threats. He warned me that going public would destroy not just him, but our entire family. He reminded me that David's political career would be ruined, that my mother's reputation in the community would be devastated, that our family business would collapse. He painted a picture of complete destruction, and for a moment, I wavered. The weight of responsibility for my family's potential ruin was crushing. But then I thought about Sarah, about a 16-year-old girl who had been so traumatized by my father's actions that she had tried to end her own life. I thought about how my silence had allowed him to continue living as a respected member of society while his victims suffered in silence. I reminded myself that I wasn't the one who had made the choice to commit these crimes. I was simply the one choosing to expose them. The argument escalated when my brother David arrived for our usual Sunday breakfast. He walked into a scene of chaos, my mother crying at the kitchen table, my father red-faced and furious, and me standing in the middle of it all with evidence of our family's darkest secrets spread before us. David's initial confusion quickly turned to anger as he processed what was happening. As a lawyer, he immediately began thinking about legal implications and damage control. He accused me of being reckless and naive, of not understanding the complexities of the situation. He argued that going to the authorities would accomplish nothing except destroying innocent people, namely, the rest of our family. David's reaction was perhaps the most painful of all because I had expected him, as someone who worked in the justice system, to understand the importance of holding criminals accountable. Instead, he was focused entirely on protecting our family's reputation and his own career prospects. He even suggested that we could handle the situation privately, perhaps by making financial reparations to Sarah's family. The idea that we could somehow buy our way out of this moral crisis disgusted me. As the morning wore on, I realized that I was completely alone in my desire to do the right thing. My family had closed ranks against me, united in their determination to protect the family name at any cost. They saw me not as someone trying to ensure justice for a victim, but as a traitor who was willing to destroy everything they had built. The isolation was suffocating. The weeks that followed were a nightmare of family meetings, desperate phone calls, and increasingly hostile confrontations. My family had launched a coordinated campaign to convince me to remain silent, employing every emotional manipulation tactic they could think of. My mother would call me crying, begging me to think about what this would do to her health, to her standing in the community, to her ability to show her face at church. She painted herself as another victim of my father's actions, which in some ways she was, but she was also asking me to prioritize her comfort over Sarah's justice. My father took a different approach, alternating between attempts at bribery and outright threats. He offered to pay for my graduate school, to help me buy a house, to do anything I wanted if I would just keep quiet. When financial incentives failed, he became more menacing, suggesting that I might find myself facing legal troubles if I continued down this path. He hinted that he had connections who could make my life very difficult, and while I wasn't sure if he was bluffing, the implications were clear. David proved to be the most persistent in his efforts to change my mind. He would show up at my apartment uninvited, armed with legal arguments about the statute of limitations. the difficulty of proving cases involving minors, and the potential for our family to be sued for defamation if we couldn't prove our allegations. He spoke about the law as if it were a game to be won, rather than a system designed to protect the innocent. His coldly logical approach to what should have been a moral imperative made me realize how fundamentally different our values had become. The pressure was relentless and exhausting. I found myself second-guessing every decision, wondering if I was being selfish or naive, if I was destroying good people for the sake of abstract principles. The weight of their disappointment and anger was crushing. And there were moments when I considered giving in just to make the pain stop. But every time I wavered, I would think about Sarah and what she must have endured. I would imagine her confusion and fear, her sense of powerlessness against an adult who held so much authority in her life. I would think about how she must have felt when she realized that no one was going to protect her, that she was alone with her trauma. During this period, I also began to see my family with new eyes. The unity they showed in protecting my father wasn't born out of love or loyalty. It was born out of fear and self-interest. They weren't defending him because they believed he was innocent. They were defending him because his guilt threatened their comfortable lives. My mother's tears weren't really about heartbreak over my father's betrayal. They were about the embarrassment of being associated with a scandal. David's legal arguments weren't about justice. They were about protecting his career ambitions. I realized that I had been raised in a family that valued appearance over substance, reputation over righteousness. We had been taught that family loyalty was the highest virtue, but that loyalty had become a weapon used to silence victims and protect predators. The revelation was liberating in some ways, but it also left me feeling utterly alone. I had always believed that family was supposed to be a source of unconditional love and support, but I was learning that their love came with conditions, chief among them being my willingness to participate in their conspiracy of silence. My isolation deepened when I realized that many of our family friends and extended relatives had been brought into the campaign to convince me to stay quiet. Suddenly, I was receiving visits from my Aunt Maria, who had raised me like a second mother, and my godfather, who had always been my champion. They spoke to me with the same mixture of disappointment and pleading that I had been hearing from my immediate family. They reminded me of all the good my father had done in the community, of the jobs he had created, of the charities he had supported. They suggested that one mistake shouldn't define a man's entire life, conveniently ignoring the fact that sexual abuse of a minor wasn't simply a mistake, it was a crime that had devastated a young person's life. The network of enablers extended far beyond my family, and I began to understand how predators like my father operated. They surrounded themselves with people who had too much invested in their reputation to risk exposure. They built systems of mutual dependence and shared complicity that made it almost impossible for victims to find support or justice. I was seeing firsthand how entire communities could become complicit in protecting abusers simply because acknowledging the truth would be too disruptive to their comfortable lives. As the pressure mounted, I began to experience physical symptoms of stress. I wasn't sleeping well, I had lost my appetite, and I was constantly anxious. My work performance began to suffer, and I found myself unable to concentrate on anything other than the moral crisis consuming my life. I was living in a state of constant vigilance, never knowing when the next family intervention would occur or what new form of manipulation would be employed. The stress was taking a toll on my health, but I knew that giving in to their demands would destroy me in a different way. The breaking point came when I discovered that my family had hired a private investigator to dig up information about my personal life. I found out when my neighbor mentioned seeing a man asking questions about my daily routine, my relationships, my habits. The realization that my own family was essentially stalking me was both terrifying and heartbreaking. It confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that they saw me not as a daughter and sister trying to do the right thing, but as an enemy to be neutralized by any means necessary. The private investigator's report, which I later obtained through a contact in David's law firm, was a catalog of my most private moments. It detailed my struggles with depression after college, my brief relationship with a married man, my financial difficulties during my early career, and even my prescription medication history. The report was clearly designed to be used against me if I persisted in my plans to expose my father. The message was clear. If I continued to threaten their secret, they would destroy my reputation and credibility. The depth of their betrayal was staggering. This wasn't just about protecting my father anymore. It was about punishing me for daring to challenge their authority. I realized that in their minds, I had become the real villain of this story. They had convinced themselves that I was a vindictive daughter who was trying to destroy an innocent man out of some twisted psychological need for attention or revenge. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this narrative was impressive, but it allowed them to justify their increasingly extreme actions. I made the decision to proceed with contacting the authorities on a cold Tuesday morning in March. I had spent the entire night sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the photographs and thinking about Sarah. I had received another letter from her mother the previous week, this time mentioning that Sarah was doing better in therapy but still struggled with trust issues and nightmares. The letter was innocuous enough, but reading between the lines, I could sense the ongoing pain that our family's secret had caused. I called the police department and asked to speak with someone in the sex crimes unit. The detective who took my call was professional but skeptical, which I suppose was understandable given the nature of my allegations. She agreed to meet with me that afternoon, and I spent the morning preparing all the evidence I had collected. The photographs were the most damning, but I also had documentation of Sarah's family's sudden move, therapy records that I had obtained through a private investigator of my own, and a detailed timeline of events that I had painstakingly reconstructed. When I met with Detective Sarah Rodriguez, I was struck by her professionalism and compassion. She listened to my story without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and explained the legal process that would follow. She was honest about the challenges we would face, the time that had passed since the incidents, the difficulty of prosecuting cases involving minors, and the resources that my father would likely marshal in his defense. But she also assured me that the allegations would be thoroughly investigated and that Sarah would be contacted to determine if she was willing to cooperate with the prosecution. The conversation with Detective Rodriguez was both relieving and terrifying. After months of carrying this burden alone, it was liberating to share it with someone who understood the gravity of the situation. But I also knew that once the investigation began, there would be no going back. My family's reaction to my decision to involve the police was swift and brutal. Within hours of my meeting with Detective Rodriguez, I received a barrage of angry phone calls from my father, my mother, and David. They had somehow learned about my visit to the police station, possibly through one of my father's contacts in local government. The accusations came fast and furious. I was a traitor, a liar, a mentally unstable woman who was destroying innocent people to satisfy some sick need for drama. My father's call was the most vicious. He told me that I was no longer his daughter, that I had betrayed everything our family stood for, and that I would live to regret my decision. He promised that he would fight the charges with every resource at his disposal, and that he would make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. The threat was clear, and it was backed up by the private investigator's report that I knew they possessed. My mother's reaction was perhaps more painful, because it was couched in terms of love and concern. She called me crying, asking me to reconsider, reminding me of all the good times we had shared as a family. She spoke about my father's community contributions, his kindness to her over the years, and the devastating impact that these allegations would have on their marriage. She portrayed herself as an innocent victim of my vendetta, conveniently ignoring the fact that she had seen the evidence with her own eyes. David's approach was characteristically legalistic. He informed me that the family would be hiring the best criminal defense attorney in the state, and that they would be pursuing all legal options to protect my father's reputation. He warned me that I could face charges for theft of private property, defamation, and potentially even extortion. He suggested that I might want to consult with my own attorney, though he made it clear that the family would not be paying for my legal representation. The message was unmistakable. I was on my own. The speed and coordination of their response revealed something that I had suspected but hoped wasn't true. They had been preparing for this possibility for some time. They had contingency plans, legal strategies, and a network of supporters, ready to defend my father at any cost. I realized that while I had been agonizing over the moral implications of my decision, they had been treating it as a strategic challenge to be overcome through superior resources and connections. The investigation moved forward with methodical precision, but the personal attacks against me intensified with each passing day. My family's campaign to discredit me had expanded beyond private pressure to include public humiliation. They began spreading carefully crafted stories about my mental health, my financial troubles, and my alleged history of making false accusations. The narrative they constructed portrayed me as an unstable woman who had harbored resentment against her successful father for years and was now seeking revenge through fabricated allegations. The effectiveness of their campaign was devastating. Friends who had known me for years began to distance themselves, unable or unwilling to distinguish between the person they knew and the character assassination being perpetrated against me. My colleagues at work started treating me differently, and I could sense the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. The small-town dynamics that had once felt comforting now felt suffocating, as if I were living in a fishbowl, where every movement was scrutinized and judged. My father's legal team was formidable and well-connected. They had begun their own investigation, not into the truth of my allegations, but into ways to destroy my credibility and derail the criminal case. They subpoenaed my medical records, my employment history, my financial records, and any documentation that might support their portrayal of me as an unreliable witness. The violation of my privacy was comprehensive and humiliating, but I understood that it was just the beginning of what would likely be a long and brutal legal battle. Detective Rodriguez kept me informed about the progress of the investigation, and I was encouraged by her professionalism and dedication. She had successfully contacted Sarah, who was now 19, and living in another state. The conversation had been difficult, but Sarah had confirmed the essential details of my allegations and expressed willingness to cooperate with the prosecution. However, she was understandably traumatized by the prospect of reliving her experiences in a public forum, and her therapist had expressed concerns about the potential impact on her mental health. The investigation had also uncovered additional evidence that supported my allegations. Computer forensics experts had found deleted files on my father's personal computer that corroborated the timeline I had provided. They had also discovered communications between my father and Sarah that were inappropriate and potentially incriminating. The evidence was building, but I knew that my father's legal team would challenge every piece of it, and they had the resources to mount a sophisticated defense. As the investigation progressed, I found myself increasingly isolated from my extended family and former friends. The social pressure to maintain family loyalty was intense, and many people seemed to view my decision to involve the police as a betrayal of fundamental values. I received anonymous letters condemning my actions, and someone even vandalized my car with the word traitor spray-painted across the windshield. The message was clear. I was no longer welcome in my own community. The financial pressure was also mounting. My father's legal team had filed motions to freeze certain family assets, claiming that I had access to accounts that I might use to fund my own legal defense. While this was largely untrue, it created additional complications and expenses that I was ill-equipped to handle. I had to hire my own attorney, and the costs were quickly consuming my savings. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being forced to bankrupt myself to seek justice for a crime that my wealthy family could easily afford to defend against. My employer, a small accounting firm, began to express concerns about the negative publicity surrounding my case. While they couldn't legally fire me for cooperating with a criminal investigation, they made it clear that my continued employment might not be viable if the situation continued to generate adverse attention. The prospect of losing my job added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. I was beginning to understand how victims and witnesses in high-profile cases could be intimidated into silence through systematic economic and social pressure. The psychological toll was enormous. I had always been close to my family, and their rejection was like a form of grief. I found myself mourning not just the loss of my relationships with them, but also the loss of the idealized version of my family that I had carried in my heart for so long. The discovery of my father's crimes had shattered my understanding of who we were as a family, and their reaction to my decision to seek justice had completed the destruction of those bonds. I began seeing a therapist to help me process the trauma of both discovering my father's crimes and being ostracized by my family. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a skilled professional who helped me understand that my feelings of guilt and isolation were normal responses to an abnormal situation. She helped me recognize that I was not responsible for my father's actions or for my family's decision to prioritize their reputation over justice. She also helped me prepare for the ongoing legal proceedings and the additional challenges that lay ahead. Through therapy, I began to understand that my family's reaction revealed something fundamental about their values and character. They had shown me that they valued loyalty over truth, reputation over justice, and comfort over courage. While this realization was painful, it also helped me understand that I was fighting for something more important than family harmony. I was fighting for the principle that victims deserve justice, regardless of the inconvenience or discomfort it might cause their abusers' families. The grand jury proceedings were scheduled for the following month, and I knew that my testimony would be crucial to securing an indictment. I spent hours preparing with the prosecutor, reviewing the evidence, and mentally preparing myself for the hostile cross-examination that would inevitably come from my father's defense team. The prosecutor, District Attorney Michelle Torres, was confident about the strength of our case, but she also warned me about the challenges ahead. She explained that my father's legal team would likely try to put me on trial, questioning my motives, my credibility, and my mental state. The grand jury indictment came down on a rainy Thursday morning in May. The charges were serious: multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor, exploitation of a child, and possession of child pornography. The evidence had been compelling enough to convince the grand jury that there was probable cause to believe my father had committed these crimes. I felt a mixture of relief and dread as I read the news coverage of the indictment. Relief because it validated my decision to speak out, and dread because I knew the real battle was just beginning. My father's arraignment was a media circus. The local news stations covered it extensively, and the courthouse was packed with reporters, family supporters, and curious onlookers. I watched from the gallery as my father, dressed in an expensive suit and flanked by his legal team, entered his plea of not guilty. He looked older than I remembered, the stress of the investigation having aged him considerably, but his demeanor was still defiant. He never looked in my direction, but I could feel the hatred radiating from my mother and David, who sat in the front row showing their support. The judge set bail at $500,000, which my father posted immediately. The conditions of his release included no contact with minors without supervision, surrender of his passport, and a prohibition against leaving the state. As he left the courthouse, he was surrounded by supporters who had rallied to his defense. I watched from a distance as my mother hugged him and David shook hands with his attorneys. They looked like a family united in crisis, while I stood alone, the outsider who had brought this storm upon them. The media coverage in the days following the arraignment was extensive and largely sympathetic to my father. The local newspaper ran a lengthy profile highlighting his business achievements and community contributions. The article mentioned the charges almost as an afterthought, focusing instead on the economic impact his businesses had on the local economy and the charitable work he had done over the years. Several prominent community leaders provided statements of support, expressing their shock at the allegations and their confidence in his innocence. The narrative being constructed in the media was troubling but predictable. My father was being portrayed as a pillar of the community who was being destroyed by false accusations, while I was depicted as a troubled daughter with questionable motives. The power of his reputation and connections was evident in the way the story was being framed. I realized that this case would be fought not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, where my father held significant advantages. Sarah's decision to testify was a crucial development in the case. Despite her understandable reluctance to relive her trauma in a public forum, she had agreed to travel back to our state to provide testimony. I never spoke with her directly, but Detective Rodriguez told me that she was determined to see justice done, even though the process would be difficult for her. Her courage, in the face of what would undoubtedly be a hostile defense strategy, was inspiring and humbling. The defense team's strategy became clear during the pretrial motions. They were going to argue that the sexual encounters between my father and Sarah had been consensual, despite the fact that she was legally a minor and incapable of giving consent to an adult in a position of authority. They planned to portray Sarah as a mature teenager who had initiated the relationship and me as a jealous daughter who had misinterpreted innocent interactions. The victim-blaming approach was disgusting but not surprising, given the resources and reputation they were trying to protect. My own preparation for testimony was intensive and emotionally draining. The prosecutor's office had arranged for me to work with a victim advocate who helped me understand the legal process and prepared me for the aggressive cross-examination I would face. We practiced handling questions about my mental health, my relationship with my father, and my motives for coming forward. The goal was to help me remain calm and credible under what would undoubtedly be intense pressure. The trial date was set for September, giving both sides several months to prepare their cases. During this time, the social and economic pressure on me continued to intensify. My family's campaign to discredit me had evolved into a sophisticated operation that included private investigators, public relations consultants, and what appeared to be a coordinated effort to influence potential jurors through strategic media placement. I began to understand how the wealthy and powerful could manipulate the justice system not through direct corruption, but through their ability to shape public perception and overwhelm their opponents with superior resources. My own financial situation was becoming increasingly precarious. The costs of my legal representation were mounting, and my employer had finally decided that the negative publicity surrounding my case was too damaging to their business reputation. They offered me a severance package that was contingent on my agreeing not to discuss my termination publicly. Clearly concerned about wrongful termination lawsuits, I accepted the package because I needed the money. But the loss of my job was another blow to my already fragile financial stability. The isolation continued to deepen as more friends and acquaintances distanced themselves from me. Some were undoubtedly influenced by my family's campaign of character assassination, but others simply found the situation too uncomfortable to navigate. I began to understand how whistleblowers and victims of powerful predators could find themselves completely alone, abandoned by the very communities they were trying to protect. The social cost of truth-telling was higher than I had ever imagined. During this period, I received an unexpected visit from my Aunt Maria, who had been like a second mother to me growing up. I hoped that she might be coming to offer support, or at least to hear my side of the story. Instead, she made one final attempt to convince me to recant my allegations. She spoke about the damage I was causing to innocent people, the pain I was inflicting on my mother, and the destruction of a family that had loved and supported me. She offered to help me start a new life in another city if I would just admit that I had been mistaken about what I had seen in those photographs. The offer was tempting in its simplicity, but I knew that accepting it would mean abandoning Sarah and allowing my father to escape consequences for his actions. I declined her offer and asked her to leave. As she walked away, I realized that I had lost another important relationship, but I also felt a sense of clarity about the path I had chosen. The trial began on a crisp September morning that felt like the beginning of the end of everything I had once known. The courthouse was packed with media, supporters of my father, and curious members of the public who had followed the case in the local news. I sat in the witness section, feeling exposed and vulnerable under the scrutiny of so many eyes. My father's legal team had assembled an impressive defense, led by Marcus Wellington, a high-profile criminal attorney known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to discredit prosecution witnesses. The prosecution was handled by District Attorney Michelle Torres and her assistant, James Chen, both of whom had worked tirelessly to prepare for this moment. The opening statements set the tone for what would be a brutal legal battle. Torres outlined the prosecution's case methodically, describing my father's abuse of his position of trust and authority to exploit a vulnerable teenager. She explained how the evidence would show a pattern of manipulation and criminal behavior that had devastated Sarah's life. Her presentation was clear and compelling, but I could see skepticism in some of the jurors' faces. The community's respect for my father was evident even in the courtroom. Wellington's opening statement was a masterclass in deflection and character assassination. He portrayed my father as a successful businessman and devoted family man who was being destroyed by false accusations. He suggested that I was a troubled daughter who had misinterpreted innocent interactions and that Sarah was an unreliable witness whose memories had been distorted by therapy and the passage of time. He promised to show that the prosecution's case was built on lies, manipulation, and a vindictive desire to destroy a good man's reputation. The first day of testimony focused on establishing the timeline and context of the alleged crimes. Detective Rodriguez presented the evidence methodically, walking the jury through the investigation process and the evidence that had been collected. The photographs were introduced as exhibits, and I watched the jurors' faces as they viewed the images. Some looked disturbed, others seemed skeptical, and a few appeared uncomfortable with the entire proceedings. The cross-examination of Detective Rodriguez was aggressive and focused on procedural issues and potential contamination of evidence. Wellington's strategy was to raise doubts about the integrity of the investigation and the reliability of the evidence. He questioned the detective's experience with cases involving minors, suggested that the evidence had been mishandled, and implied that the investigation had been compromised by pressure from the prosecutor's office. The attack was relentless, but predictable, and Detective Rodriguez handled it with professional composure. Sarah's testimony was scheduled for the third day of the trial, and I knew it would be the most crucial and difficult part of the proceedings. I had not seen her since she was 16, and I wondered how she would handle the pressure of facing my father and his legal team in open court. The night before her testimony, I couldn't sleep, thinking about the courage it must take for her to confront her abuser in such a public forum. When Sarah took the stand, she was visibly nervous but determined. She had grown into a young woman, but I could still see traces of the vulnerable teenager she had been when my father had exploited her. Her testimony was heartbreaking and compelling as she described the gradual escalation of my father's inappropriate behavior, the confusion and fear she had felt, and the long-term impact his actions had on her life. She spoke about the nightmares, the difficulty trusting adults, and the suicide attempts that had followed. Her voice was steady but filled with pain, and I could see several jurors wiping away tears. The cross-examination of Sarah was brutal and exactly what I had expected from Wellington. He attacked her credibility, her memory, and her motives for coming forward. He suggested that she had been coached by therapists and prosecutors, that her memories were false or distorted, and that she was seeking attention or financial compensation. He questioned her about her mental health treatment, her academic performance, and her relationships with other adults. The line of questioning was designed to portray her as an unreliable witness whose testimony should be discounted. Sarah handled the aggressive questioning with remarkable poise, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. She remained consistent in her testimony, despite Wellington's attempts to confuse or contradict her. When he suggested that she had initiated the sexual contact, she looked directly at him and said firmly that she had been a child who didn't understand what was happening to her. Her strength in that moment was inspiring, but I also felt guilty for the pain she was being forced to endure because of my decision to pursue justice. My own testimony came on the fourth day of the trial, and I had prepared for it as thoroughly as possible. I described discovering the photographs, my confrontation with my father, and my decision to contact the authorities. I explained my thought process and the moral obligation I felt to ensure that Sarah received justice. The prosecution's questions were straightforward and designed to establish my credibility and my motives for coming forward. I tried to remain calm and factual, knowing that any display of emotion might be used against me. Wellington's cross-examination of me was devastating and personal. He attacked my mental health history, my relationship with my father, and my motives for exposing the photographs. He suggested that I was a vindictive daughter who had been jealous of my father's success and had fabricated the entire story to destroy him. He questioned my financial situation, my employment history, and my personal relationships, painting a picture of an unstable woman who couldn't be trusted. He even brought up my brief relationship with a married man, suggesting that it demonstrated my poor judgment and lack of moral character. The attack was comprehensive and humiliating, but I had expected it and tried to respond with dignity and honesty. When Wellington suggested that I had stolen the photographs and manufactured the evidence, I looked directly at the jury and explained that I had found them while helping my father with his business affairs, and that I had never wanted to discover such terrible evidence about someone I had loved and respected. The trial continued for 2 more weeks, with expert witnesses, character witnesses, and additional evidence presented by both sides. My father's supporters testified about his community contributions and his character, while forensic experts explained the technical evidence that supported the prosecution's case. The battle lines were clearly drawn, and it seemed that the outcome would depend on whether the jury believed Sarah's testimony and my account of discovering the evidence, or whether they would accept the defense's portrayal of us as unreliable witnesses with questionable motives. The closing arguments crystallized the fundamental conflict at the heart of the case. District Attorney Torres spoke passionately about the importance of protecting children from predators, regardless of their social status or community standing. She reminded the jury that wealth and reputation do not excuse criminal behavior, and that victims deserve justice even when their abusers are powerful and well-connected. She walked through the evidence systematically, connecting the photographs, the timeline, and the testimony to build a compelling case for my father's guilt. Her presentation was professional and moving, but I could sense the uphill battle she faced in convincing a jury to convict a respected member of their community. Wellington's closing argument was a masterpiece of misdirection and emotional manipulation. He spoke about the presumption of innocence, the importance of not destroying good people based on unreliable evidence, and the tragedy of false accusations. He portrayed my father as a victim of a vindictive daughter and a troubled young woman whose memories had been corrupted by therapy and the passage of time. He suggested that convicting my father would send a dangerous message that anyone could be destroyed by false accusations, regardless of their contributions to society. His argument was effective and played directly to the jury's potential reluctance to convict someone they had respected for years. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and each hour felt like an eternity. I waited at home, unable to concentrate on anything except the possibility that my father might be acquitted. The prospect of his vindication was terrifying, not just because it would mean he had escaped justice, but because it would validate my family's portrayal of me as a liar and a destroyer of innocent lives. I thought about Sarah and how she would handle an acquittal, given the courage she had shown in testifying. I also thought about the message it would send to other victims of powerful predators, that justice was only available to those whose abusers lacked the resources to defend themselves effectively. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed with media, supporters, and curious onlookers. I sat in the back row, my heart pounding as the foreman stood to read the verdict. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could see my father's hands shaking as he waited to hear his fate. The verdict was mixed: guilty on 2 counts of sexual abuse of a minor, but not guilty on the exploitation and child pornography charges. The jury had apparently believed Sarah's testimony about the sexual abuse, but had not been convinced by the photographic evidence, possibly due to questions about how it had been obtained and preserved. The conviction was a victory, but a limited one that felt somehow incomplete. My father's reaction to the verdict was a mixture of shock and rage. He turned to look at me for the first time during the trial, and the hatred in his eyes was unmistakable. My mother collapsed into sobs, and David immediately began conferring with the defense team about appeal options. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps, and I felt a strange sense of detachment from the scene unfolding around me. I had achieved what I had set out to do. My father had been held accountable for his crimes, but the victory felt hollow, given the cost it had exacted on my life and relationships. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later, and it provided another opportunity for both sides to present their cases. The prosecution asked for the maximum sentence, emphasizing the severity of the crimes and the lasting impact on Sarah's life. Character witnesses testified about my father's contributions to the community, his role as a job creator, and his previously clean record. The defense argued for leniency, suggesting that my father had already suffered enough through the loss of his reputation and his businesses. Wellington painted a picture of a man who had made a terrible mistake but who still had value to contribute to society. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Thompson, delivered a sentence that reflected the complexity of the case. She sentenced my father to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. She acknowledged his previous contributions to the community, but emphasized that his position of trust and authority had made his crimes particularly egregious. She also noted the courage shown by Sarah in coming forward and the importance of holding powerful individuals accountable for their actions. The sentence was neither as severe as the prosecution had requested nor as lenient as the defense had hoped for. My father was immediately taken into custody, and I watched as he was led away in handcuffs. The sight of him in shackles was both satisfying and heartbreaking. Satisfying because it represented justice for Sarah, but heartbreaking because it was the final destruction of the man I had once loved and respected as my father. My mother's reaction to the sentencing was devastating. To witness, she had aged considerably during the trial, and the reality of her husband's imprisonment seemed to break something fundamental in her spirit. She looked at me with a mixture of grief and hatred that cut through my heart. In her mind, I was responsible for destroying her marriage and her life, and I knew that our relationship would never recover from this betrayal. The media coverage of the verdict and sentencing was extensive but divided. Some outlets focused on the conviction and the importance of holding powerful individuals accountable, while others emphasized the destruction of a respected businessman and the divisive impact on the community. The local newspaper ran an editorial questioning whether justice had been served, or whether a good man had been destroyed by false accusations. The public reaction was similarly divided, with some people supporting my decision to come forward, and others viewing me as a traitor who had destroyed her own family for selfish reasons. The aftermath of the trial was a strange mixture of relief and devastation. I had achieved what I had set out to do. My father had been convicted and sentenced for his crimes against Sarah, but the personal cost had been enormous. The relationship with my family was completely destroyed, and I was essentially an outcast in my own community. The financial burden of the legal proceedings had left me nearly bankrupt, and my career prospects were severely damaged by the negative publicity surrounding the case. I had won the battle for justice, but I had lost almost everything else in the process. The weeks following the sentencing were marked by a profound sense of emptiness. I had spent months focused on the trial and the pursuit of justice, and suddenly I found myself without a clear purpose or direction. The adrenaline and determination that had sustained me through the legal proceedings had evaporated, leaving me feeling drained and uncertain about my future. I was unemployed, nearly broke, and completely isolated from my family and former friends. The victory I had achieved felt hollow when weighed against the destruction of my personal life. I began to understand why so many people choose to remain silent about abuse, even when they have evidence of wrongdoing. The social and economic costs of truth-telling are enormous, and they fall disproportionately on those who lack the resources to defend themselves against powerful interests. I had been privileged enough to have some savings and education, but even I had struggled to maintain my financial stability and emotional well-being throughout the process. I could only imagine how much more difficult it would be for someone with fewer resources or less social support. During this period, I received an unexpected letter from Sarah. She thanked me for my courage in coming forward and for enduring the difficult trial process. She wrote that seeing my father convicted had provided her with a sense of closure that she had never expected to achieve. She also acknowledged the personal cost I had paid for seeking justice and expressed her gratitude for my sacrifice. The letter was deeply meaningful to me because it reminded me that my actions had served a purpose beyond my own need for moral clarity. Sarah's healing and sense of justice had been worth the price I had paid. I also received letters from other survivors of sexual abuse who had followed the case in the media. Many of them wrote to express their admiration for my decision to come forward and their understanding of the challenges I had faced. Some shared their own stories of abuse and the reasons they had chosen to remain silent. Their letters helped me understand that my case had broader implications beyond my own family's situation. I had become a symbol of the possibility that powerful predators could be held accountable even when they had significant resources and community support. The decision to leave town became inevitable as the months passed. The social ostracism was complete, and I found it impossible to build a new life in a place where I was viewed with suspicion and hostility by so many people. I had applied for jobs in other cities and finally received an offer from an accounting firm in Portland, Oregon. The salary was lower than what I had been earning, but it represented a chance to start over in a place where people didn't know my story. The process of leaving was both liberating and heartbreaking. I sold my house at a loss, packed my belongings, and prepared to abandon the only home I had ever known. As I drove through town for the last time, I passed the hardware store that had been my father's pride and joy, now closed and for sale. I drove by the church where my mother had been so active, knowing that I would never again share a pew with her. Pafta, elementary school where I had learned to read, the high school where I had graduated, and the college where I had studied accounting. Each landmark represented a piece of my life that I was leaving behind forever. The new life I built in Portland was modest but peaceful. I rented a small apartment, began working at a mid-sized accounting firm, and slowly started to rebuild my social connections. I was honest with new friends about my past, and I was grateful to discover that many people respected my decision to seek justice, even understanding the personal cost. The anonymity of city life was comforting after the suffocating scrutiny of small-town existence. I could walk down the street without wondering if people were whispering about me or judging my actions. My relationship with my family never recovered, as I had expected. My mother sent me a brief note informing me that she was divorcing my father and moving to live with her sister in another state. She made it clear that she blamed me for the destruction of her marriage, and that she had no desire to maintain any relationship with me. David's political career had been damaged by the scandal, and he had left town to start over in a different state. He never contacted me, and I learned about his movements through mutual acquaintances. The family that had once been the center of my world had scattered to the winds, destroyed by the revelation of my father's crimes and my decision to expose them. I began seeing a new therapist in Portland, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in helping people who had been ostracized for whistleblowing or speaking out against powerful interests. She helped me understand that my experience was not unique, that many people who choose to expose wrongdoing face similar patterns of isolation and retaliation. She introduced me to support groups for whistleblowers and survivors of family trauma, where I met other people who had made similar choices and faced similar consequences. The therapy and support groups were crucial in helping me process the grief and loss I felt about my family relationships. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I was mourning not just the loss of my actual family, but also the loss of the idealized version of my family that had existed in my mind before I discovered my father's crimes. She helped me recognize that the people who had rejected me had revealed their true values and character, and that maintaining relationships with them would have required me to compromise my own integrity.